Did you know that the most widely used weed killer in America is made by a pharmaceutical company? Bayer makes Roundup herbicide.
Bayer, the company that makes the brand of aspirin millions of Americans have taken at some point in their lifetime, bought Monsanto in 2018 for $63 billion and inherited the highly profitable herbicide.
Bayer inherited thousands of lawsuits over Roundup-related cancer claims, too. I'm Terry Turner for Drugwatch, and this is Big Pharma Behind the Scenes from Drugwatch.
And I'm Whitney Bona, attorney and consumer safety advocate at Drugwatch. In this episode, we're exploring how Big Pharma is playing the long game, socialized risks, privatized profits.
When a weed killer like Roundup is associated with non-Hodgkin lymphoma, as some studies suggest and thousands of lawsuits claim, you might expect regulators to move fast, change the label, restrict its use, maybe even pull it off the market.
But with products like Roundup, we've seen federal regulators move slowly, even as juries award huge verdicts to people who say they were never properly warned about the risks.
The Environmental Protection Agency has repeatedly said that glyphosate, the main ingredient in Roundup, is not likely to cause cancer when used as directed.
At the same time, state courts have allowed failure to warn lawsuits, and juries have found that Monsanto and later Bayer didn't adequately disclose the risks. As a result, lawsuits have become the main way these safety questions are tested.
Meanwhile, Bayer has spent years in appeals and settlement talks trying to contain an estimated 197,000 Roundup lawsuits.
For companies, the choice can look simple. Keep selling, keep fighting, and hope the cost of litigation stays below what the product brings in, or convince the U.S. Supreme Court to shut the lawsuits down altogether.
That's where pricing, profit, and legal risk intersect. When a drug or chemical stays on the market despite red flags, lawsuits become kind of a shadow regulator, one that can reveal what official oversight often misses.
We'll look at how that dynamic plays out across other industries and what it means for public trust. In our last episode, we looked at how corporate planning starts early, shaping trials, messaging, and even legal strategy before a drug hits the pharmacy.
This time we're following the money. A 2023 BMJ study found that thousands of orphan drug approvals, many for common cancers, rely on small trials that can overestimate effectiveness. When drugs get to market on that kind of non-robust evidence, how do drug and device giants turn it into pricing power? And how does litigation push back when the public pays for treatments that underperform or quietly cause harm?
That's the question we put to reporters Shannon Brownlee and Jeannie Lenzer. Their recent investigative series shed light on this whole process. Here's Brownlee talking about the money at stake with a new drug.
It's huge. They've invested an enormous amount of money. And this is one of the fundamental problems with the way we develop drugs in this country and in Western Europe, is that because these companies put all this financial risk into the process of developing drugs, they then feel justified and are told that they are justified by Wall Street and by insurers and by all kinds of people, that they are justified in taking very, very big profits on drugs that get approved. And so if they get a drug through, they're going to make that money back, and then they're going to be able to take in pretty big profits. And the economic consequences of that for everybody else are not good, because we, meaning we patients, we taxpayers, because we pay taxes for Medicare and Medicaid, we insurers, and the reality is we patients are the ones who fund insurers, we employers, we are all paying for drugs that aren't working. And we are then paying again for drugs that harm people because we have to take care of those people.
Brownlee says the key problem is the way we've tied drug development to private financial risk. Companies put up the money for drug trials, then argue they're entitled to charge whatever they want on the back end because they earned it by taking that risk.
But the way she lays it out, the public actually underwrites a lot of that gamble through premiums, taxes, and out-of-pocket costs, especially when the drugs that make it through don't work very well. Here's Brownlee again.
And we all pool those resources one way or another in the form of either private insurance or Medicare and Medicaid. So the cost of this is very, very high for everybody. So what they've done, as Jeannie likes to say, is they've basically socialized risk and privatized the profit.
She's describing a cycle where we all pay several times over. We pay for the drug itself, we pay again when people are harmed and need more medical care, and we pay through public programs when Medicare and Medicaid pick up the bill. Here's Jeannie Lenzer.
Once these very expensive drugs get on the market, it's the failure of post-market surveillance. They have these red flags that they are either not working or they're only marginally effective, and they've got these harms. That's exactly what they've done with post-market surveillance. So we don't know if the drugs are safe. They can keep these very expensive drugs on the market. And how do they do it? Their patent protection is enormous. So with the Alzheimer's drugs, we filed Freedom of Information Act requests for the mortality data that's supposed to be filed annually with the FDA. And we were told that the FDA will not release those data until 2036 and 2037. So you have these red flags of harm, and we're not allowed to know the answer to that, and patients keep taking the drugs. And this is typically what happens with the drugs that we found that were either removed 10, 15, 20 years later or not removed at all.
Lenzer points to Alzheimer's drugs we talked about last time, notably Aduhelm, approved through a fast-track FDA process, but still controversial as inadequate or ineffective. You have early red flags, tiny benefits, real risks, and almost no transparency in the post-market data. Brownlee's and Lenzer's Freedom of Information Act requests for annual mortality figures were denied or delayed by regulators who said they wouldn't release those figures for more than a decade.
So you've got high prices up front, thin evidence at approval, weak surveillance after approval, and a lack of transparency around outcomes. That combination is what Lenzer describes as socialized risk and privatized profit. The upside flows to the shareholders while the downside gets spread across patients and public budgets.
If that sounds abstract, cardiologist and researcher Dr. Peter Coey brings it down to earth with a simple question in his book, Failure to Treat. He questions how much less drugs would cost if companies weren't spending so much on advertising and promotion.
It boggles my mind. I keep asking the question, how effective are these commercials? How much do they benefit patients and physicians who have to prescribe the medications? Do they generate revenue that comes back and helps further development of newer drugs? If that were true, then I think a lot of us would probably put up with a lot more of it. But it looks to me that a lot of it is just greed. We just want to sell more drug, and we're going to do whatever we can to increase demand. And one of the ways we can increase demand is by telling patients to go talk to their doctor and ask for the drug. It's an absurd situation, obviously, because, as I said in the book, if you need to ask your oncologist about a new drug for pancreatic cancer, then you certainly should have another oncologist.
Dr. Coey's watching the same commercials we all see, those endless drug ads telling patients to ask their doctor about the latest product. And he's wondering whether those billions in marketing costs really help anyone, or mostly just drive up demand and justify higher prices. Whitney, I think this might be a good time to flag a new JAMA research letter that really ties into what we're uncovering in this series, especially around how pharma influences patient demand after a drug gets approved.
It analyzed high engagement social media posts about GLP-1s, ADHD stimulants, and autoimmune biologics, things people are seeing every day. This appears to be a new part of marketing drugs to consumers.
And what's striking is that 80% of those high engagement posts looked like influencer marketing but didn't disclose sponsorship. That's basically hidden advertising.
Right, and it's not just marketing. The post overwhelmingly touted benefits like life-changing or revolutionary, while only a third mentioned risks. That is a major imbalance.
That's the same pattern we see in litigation. Companies push drugs to market quickly, and then the real costs start to show up later through harm, lawsuits, and settlements.
The logic is straightforward. If you're spending huge sums to blanket TV and social media with drug ads, that money has to come from somewhere. And in the current system, that somewhere is often higher prices.
Now, Coey isn't saying companies are trying to harm patients. He's saying the bigger issue is what happens when those same drugs are priced and marketed to maximize profits.
I don't think that pharmaceutical companies should be impugned for putting patients at jeopardy. I don't think that happens. In fact, I think they put safeguards into place so that doesn't happen. Some of that is obviously because of product liability concerns. So I think safety is okay. And I think the process of drug development with data monitoring committees and adjudication committees and regulatory oversight, I think preserves that. However, the pricing for drugs is clearly reckless. We are being overcharged for medication, which means that many patients can't access the medications. And that is the fault of the pharmaceutical company. And that's where it gets into this question about profits. I mean, the way you drive profits, obviously, is by charging as much as you can for each widget that you sell. The other thing that's happened in the pharmaceutical world is that there's an increasing interest in charging large amounts of money for orphan indications.
Dr. Coey's careful to say most companies do have guardrails around outright safety disasters because they know product liability is real and because doctors care about safety. But when it comes to pricing, he doesn't mince words. He calls it reckless.
He also points to orphan drugs and niche conditions where companies can charge six-figure prices because there's no competition and patients are desperate. Then add on advertising that tells people with serious illnesses to push for the newest, most expensive option, and you can see how the profit-first model turns into real-world harm when patients can't afford medications or health systems strain under the cost.
It's lobbying from the pharmaceutical companies that really keeps a lot of that going. You know, I sat on FDA advisory committees for years, and what was really almost comical is that we were not allowed as advisory committee members to bring up anything about drug pricing. I mean, we're not able to use the word price or money or anything because, and then we would get our wrists slapped.
To recap, Dr. Coey sat on FDA advisory committees where he wasn't even allowed to mention price. By law, those committees are supposed to focus on safety and efficacy, not cost or comparative value. In places like Europe, regulators can grant premium pricing only when a new drug clearly outperforms older ones, and if it doesn't get the higher price.
Here in the US, there's no built-in requirement for that kind of value test. So a drug can be marginally better or no better at all and still be launched at a staggering price backed by massive ad campaigns. That's the pricing side of the playbook.
So where does litigation fit into all of this? With runaway prices and potentially thin evidence, you might hope that big settlements and government enforcement actions would deter companies from cutting corners.
We asked whistleblower advocate Lewis Clark, CEO of the Government Accountability Project, whether lawsuits and government cases actually change behavior or if they're just another line item on a balance sheet.
Frankly, I think it's a cost of doing business. OxyContin is a good example of that. They were very well aware of the problem that they had, you know, the number of people dying, the number of people addicted, and the aggressive, over-the-top sales forces that they employed to get people hooked on the drug. They saw all that, but they continued on because it was a very, very profitable drug. And as you see the stories about how that whole disaster began to unravel, is that people were raising those concerns, had an incredible difficult time getting anyone to listen to them. I'm talking very much Department of Justice and prosecutors, very difficult. And the ones that did take up the cause, they were under pressure to take it easy. You know, they were under pressure. So it was immense struggle.
Clark points to OxyContin, a powerful prescription opioid painkiller, as a case study. He says executives knew about addiction and overdose problems, and they saw the aggressive sales tactics that pushed people toward higher doses and long-term use. Yet they kept going because the drug was just that profitable.
When people inside and outside the company tried to raise concerns, they struggled to get traction, not just with regulators, but even with some prosecutors. Clark describes enormous pressure on the few enforcement officials who did try to bring serious cases.
That's his worry, that for some firms, even massive settlements are just treated as part of the marketing budget rather than a real deterrent. When a drug is making billions and only paying out a fraction of its profits in fines or settlements years later, it can still look like a good deal. Whitney, when you look at that mix, pricing, profit, litigation, the things that our guest talked about today, where do you see the law actually changing corporate behavior, and where is it struggling to keep up?
Well, the law plays an important role when it comes to disclosure. Lawsuits that reveal internal documents about side effects, marketing, or pricing can shift what regulators, judges, and juries are willing to accept. So, this can result in stronger warning labels, clearer consent forms, or even the decision to pull or change a product instead of continuing to just pay out settlements. But as Clark points out, if settlements are small compared to profits, companies may just see them as a business expense. And this is even more likely when there's no real change, like admitting wrongdoing, bringing in outside monitors, or changing how prices or risks are shared. So, the challenge from a consumer protection standpoint is to ensure litigation and enforcement are large and transparent enough to change the incentives going forward. When verdicts and settlements reshape what boards and investors expect, when they make it clear that hiding risk and overpricing marginal drugs won't pay off in the long run, that's when litigation starts to function as a real regulatory force and not just a cleanup crew.
Thanks, Whitney. And that's where we're heading in this series, toward the companies and cases that show up again and again on the wrong side of that line.
Next time on Big Pharma Behind the Scenes, we'll look at the companies that have made the largest personal injury or product liability settlements, and we'll build an accountability index. What repeat settlements and penalties can tell us about patterns of corporate behavior?
You've been listening to Big Pharma Behind the Scenes from Drugwatch. If you found this episode helpful, follow or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And visit drugwatch.com for more information on dangerous drugs, medical devices, and ongoing lawsuits.